I must wait a moment. I'm low on spirit. I'm not ready yet.
So today I want to go over what I think is one of the most unique and interesting builds in Diablo 4, and this is a Boulder build for the Druid. And this build does require two uniques, one of which being one of the coolest uniques in the game in the Dolmen Stone. Now the special of this is casting Boulder while Hurricane is active will cause your boulders to rotate around you. So using boulders with Hurricane means all of your boulders are trapped in your Hurricane and spin around you. So you can basically just have dozens of boulders constantly spinning around you, and every time one of those boulders hits an enemy, it does the normal damage a boulder would be doing, which is quite a lot. And the other unique you need is Tempest Roar, and it has a lucky hit. Storm skills have up to a 25% chance to grant 4 spirit. This does help with some spirit generation, which you do need with this build, but you're primarily using this because your base storm skills are now also werewolf skills, and because we're going to have Hurricane up basically 100% of the time, this will allow us to poison everything, giving us a bunch of additional scaling. That brings us to our skill tree, starting with our generator, which is Wind Shear, primarily using this just because it's a ranged generator. Upgrade 1 can make enemies vulnerable. Upgrade 2 gives you stacking movement speed. Then we're going down, we're taking Bloodhowl, which is just a big heal. Upgrade 1 reduces its cooldown per kill. Upgrade 2 gives us increased attack speed, which is important in this build because we can cast more boulders, meaning we're just going to be doing more damage. Then 1 point into Hurricane, which we're obviously going to need for this build to actually work. Upgrade 1 slows enemies. Upgrade 2 reduces the damage enemies are going to deal. Then 5 points into Boulder. Upgrade 1 can slow or CC enemies. Upgrade 2 gives your Boulder 20% increased crit chance while you have any fortify. So Boulder is going to have a really high crit chance, which is another way that this build is very strong. Then we're going 1 into Trample. This is just going to help us with movement, give us an unstoppable. Upgrade 1 does more damage to less enemies hit. And upgrade 2, another main reason we're taking this is because it generates us 40 spirit. Then we're going down, we're taking Petrify. CCs basically all enemies on your screen, makes them take increased critical strike damage, and on bosses it just makes them take even more critical strike damage. And then our capstone is going to be Nature's Fury. Casting an Earth skill has a 30% chance to trigger a free Storm skill, and vice versa. We're also going to be using the Legendary Aspect, where whenever this procs, it reduces the cooldown of the opposite element's abilities, and this is the main way we're going to be able to have Hurricane up 100% of the time. Then we have our passive, starting with Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulses. Your core skills cost more but do massively increased damage. 3 into Predatory Instinct for increased critical strike chance. We're taking 3 into Ancestral Fortitude for increased resistances, 3 into Vigilance for a DR after using a defensive skill, which will be up most of the time because Bloodhowl gets so many resets. Then 3 into Crushing Earth. Earth skills deal increased damage to CC'd enemies. 3 into Stone Guard. When you have Fortify above 50% of your max life, your Earth skills deal more damage. Then 1 into Safeguard. Critical strikes with Earth skills fortify you for 2% of your base life. This will keep us basically 100% fortified for most of the time, because if we have 24 boulders around us, every single one just slapping all enemies, that's going to be a lot of crits. Then 1 into Neurotoxin, so we can get 1 into Toxic Claws. Crits with werewolf skills poison the enemy. We only care that they're poisoned for more scaling. And because of our Tempest Roar, Hurricane is a werewolf skill, so it's always just going to be poisoning everything. Then 3 into Envenom. You deal massively increased critical strike damage to poisoned enemies. Then we're taking 3 into Defiance. Nature skills deal more damage to elites. 3 into Circle of Life. Nature skills that cost spirit heal you for 3% of your max life. This is our main healing. Then 3 into Natural Disaster. Earth skills deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Storm skills deal more damage to immobilize enemies. Then 3 into Resonance. Nature skills deal increased damage. Triple this bonus if a Storm skill is the next skill after an Earth skill, and vice versa. So some pretty massive damage increases. And then for our Spirit Boons, Wariness to take reduced damage from elites. We're using Swooping Attacks for increased attack speed, and Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage. Then I'm currently using Energize, which is a lucky hit. Dealing damage has a chance to restore 10 spirit. Now it does seem like this actually procs quite a bit, and the main reason I'm using this is because nothing else in this row is really that useful. Now if you're doing super high tier content and you notice you need more fortify, take Bolster. This will fortify you for 15% of your max life every time you use your Bloodhowl. And then finally we have Obsidian Slam. Every 20th kill will cause your next Earth skill to overpower. And then we have our Companion. Now this is going to be a good setup, but this is going to change pretty heavily when I can get my unique stones. The boss is currently disabled because it was broken, but once you start getting your unique stones, there's a lot better setups. But starting off, we have Flash of Adrenaline, which is just a multiplicative damage increase for you. We have Tactical Support, which reduces its cooldown. We have Duration Support that increases its duration. And then for a placeholder, we have Gripping Support. So this will pull all enemies in when this is used. And as you level up Flash of Adrenaline, Tactical Support, and Duration Support, you'll get to a point where you can have this up 100% of the time. Currently, I have a 3-second downtime, but leveling these up more, it'll be up 100% of the time, and you'll replace the Gripping Support with Genesis. Then we're using Tempest. The primary reason we're taking this is because it's the fastest casting ability that your companion can use, currently at 0.7 seconds. We're using Swift Support, which increases the attack speed. That's why it's down to 0.7 second speed. We have Resource Support. Anytime this is cast, it'll give us some amount of resources. Mine's currently at 12. And then we have Efficiency Support. Whenever Tempest hits an enemy, you get increased critical strike chance to that enemy. Really good for bosses. And the mix of Tempest with Swift Support, so it casts very quickly, and Resource Support is a massive. You'll generate a ridiculous amount of sphere with this combination. Next up, we have our Paragon Boards, and this will probably change once I get a lot of my glyphs up to 15 and then max them all out, but this is still pretty good for right now. The starting board, we're taking Tectonic, increased critical strike damage with Earth skills. The secondary gives you 20% lucky hit, which does help a bit with this build. Then the first board we're taking is Heightened Malice. While 3 or more enemies are poisoned, you deal absurdly high increased damage, and pretty much everything's going to always be poisoned with this build. The glyph we're taking is Earth and Sky, which buffs all magic nodes within range, then gives our nature skills increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. This is pretty good because we'll get increased damage to poison enemies, damage reduction from poison enemies, and we can get a lot of those buffs to secondary stats. Then we're going over to the left, we're taking the Inner Beast board. After shapeshifting, your spirit costs are reduced by 10% for 5 seconds up to 30%. Massive reduction, so we can get a lot more boulders out. The glyph we're taking is Undaunted. I currently don't really have mine leveled at all, but this will give us increased damage while fortified and damage reduction while fortified. This is actually a pretty big buff once you get this thing leveled up. Then we're going down, we're taking the Earthern Devastation board. Your Earth skills deal increased critical strike damage based upon your damage versus crowd control. Mine is only at 22%, but that's multiplicative, so it's still pretty big. As you optimize your gear more, this will be a pretty big damage increase as well. The glyph we're taking is Outmatch, which is a buff to rare nodes, and this will be pretty big. Currently, it gives critical strike with Earth skills, some additional willpower, and some additional resistances, which will actually be really good with helping us cap our resistances. Then we're going up, we're taking the Ancestral Guidance board. After spending 75 spirit, you deal massively increased damage for 5 seconds. This will be up a lot of the time as well. Then we're going back down, we're going all the way over to the right, we're taking the Constricting Tendrils board. We're not taking the legendary node itself, and we're taking the Spirit glyph, which I really don't have leveled up either. This will give us increased critical strike damage, and then once you get the secondary, your crits will make enemies take pretty big increased damage from you. And then we have our gear, starting with our gems, which we want critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies and our weapons. We want max life in our gear. And then in your jewelry, you want whatever is going to cap out your resistances. So you want 70% on everything. I currently just have resistance to all elements, so diamonds in my jewelry. But depending on your gear and your glyph levels, you may want to change these up. And if you don't need any resistances from your gems in your jewelry, just put armor in there. And as we went over, you need Tempest Roar and you need the Dolmen Stone. You need both of those for the build to work. You can do the build without Tempest Roar, but the build's going to be a lot weaker because you don't have that poison scaling. For our other offensive aspects, one of the main ones is when your Nature Fury's key passive triggers a free skill, your non-ultimate cooldowns if the opposite type are reduced. This is how we have Hurricane up 100% of the time. The build really doesn't work without Hurricane. Then your core skills do up to 30% increased multiplicative damage based on your Fortify, huge damage increase. Then Boulder is now a core skill and costs 40 spirit to cast, dealing up to 120% of its normal damage. This is very big. This is also required because now this gets a ton of additional scaling from core skills and you're going to be able to spam it. Then casting a storm skill grants you earth skills, massively increased critical strike damage, and casting an earth skill increases the critical strike chance of your storm skills. Then finally, the main way you're going to be getting spirit back on anything besides a boss fight is restore up to 4 of your primary resource when you crowd control an enemy. Now Boulder actually CCs enemies at a baseline. It knocks them back, and that still happens when they're circling around you. So basically, anytime you hit something that can be knocked back, it will be knocked back from your boulder and you'll generate a bunch of resource. So when you're in AoE situations, you almost have infinite resources. On a boss, a bunch of the other elements of the build are going to come into play, and that's how you can have still really good spear generation on boss fights as well. And then for our defensive aspects, you're going to want basic skills grant you damage reduction for 4 seconds, pretty big damage reduction for survivability. Then we're going to be using the new aspect that gives you a pretty big chunk of armor, but your evade has 100% increased cooldown. Now, the primary thing you're going to want in combination with this is the boots that have the implicit that reduce the cooldown of your dodge on attacks. This will mean you still have your evade or your dodge basically anytime you need it when you have those boots with the implicit, which I don't currently have. So you'll just be getting massively increased armor. And also, if you put this aspect on, it doesn't actually show or give you the armor while in a town. You have to go outside of a town and not be on a mount. Then you'll see the additional armor. And with kind of the base armor of the Druid and with all of your gear and with our Paragon boards mixed in with this legendary aspect, you will have capped armor while in actual combat. And you can completely offset the downside of this legendary aspect if you have those boots we went over. But then on your boots, you want while unstoppable, and 4 seconds after, you gain increased movement speed and can freely move through enemies. Now, the freely move through enemies is very important because Boulder will constantly knock back enemies, so this will help you move through them and to be able to control where you're knocking them back much more easily. Now, I'm not going to be going over gear stats in my videos anymore, but in every single one of my videos, there'll be a build planner linked in the description, so you can just look at the written version of this build. And I think it's going to be much easier to just look at a list of all of the best stats for your gear instead of having me take a few minutes and go through all the stats I have on my gear and then go over the ones that I think could be better. So I think that's going to be much easier and it's going to cut down on how long some of these build videos can be. But that's the entirety of the Boulder build for the Druid. And like I mentioned, this is one of the most interesting and unique builds in the game. It's really fun. It plays very different from most other builds and it's still really strong in AoE situations. And I think it may even be better against bosses because you can just stack up basically infinite boulders in your hurricane. So on bosses, you can kill them pretty quickly and it's generally pretty simple to use in those boss fights. And in any AoE situation, you'll basically just be walking and killing everything as you pass by. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.
I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. 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 I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet.